Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the Vedaya program with your host Tariq Khan. Today we'll analyze and explore various perspectives on contemporary and progressive Islam in the context of traditional and modern way of Islamic lifestyle. It is honor for me to introduce Prof.Dr. Adis. You are Professor of Study of Islam and Society and Senior Fellow at Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue, Griffith University, Australia. Sir, thank you so much for joining and you are most welcome in program.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
So what do you mean by progressive Islam and progressive Muslims in a real sense? As you know, Islam is the Islam and the Muslims are the Muslims since the 14 years ago. What is your analysis?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that this is a very complicated question, and I will probably not have time to explain in its entirety. And that's why I have written two books that deal with this subject matter in a lot of detail from the perspective of the Islamic intellectual tradition. But let me try and mention some most important points maybe. Yeah. First of all, we know that there is something called the Islamic intellectual tradition, an Islamic cultural and religious heritage. So Islam has always been interpreted in different ways by different people. We know that when we think of Islam, we think of different schools of theology. When we think of Islam, we think of different schools of legal thought, the madhahib. Then we, of course, have the akhlaq element, the Islamic ethics. We have Islamic spirituality, tasawwuf. We have Quranic exegesis. We have Islamic theology, proper ilm al-kalam. And so we have many different sciences within the Islamic intellectual tradition. And we know that these sciences were constructed and were developed over a period of time, often taking hundreds of years to emerge and to reach some kind of consensus on certain issues. So it is, from my perspective and from the perspective of the Islamic intellectual tradition, it is very difficult to talk about one singular Islam. Yeah. So when we want to, for example, try and define what is Sunni Islam, let's say in this sense, we inevitably have to be selective. And we have to say that, at certain point in time, certain people have said certain things, and over time, a consensus was perhaps reached of some kind that established what we can call traditionalist or mainstream Sunni or Shia Islam or whatever it be. So let's say in the case of mainstream Sunni Islam, scholarship tells us that what most people today in the Sunni world, let's say in particular, consider to be Sunni Islam is something that more or less had became or had its structure or form around the late 5th century of Hijri. Yeah? So, and we all know that in what we consider to be mainstream Sunni Islam, it is usually discussed in terms of the three schools of theology, Ashari, Maturidi, and Athari or Salafi. And when it comes to Islamic legal schools, we in mainstream Sunni Islam, as you know, there are the four main schools of thought. But if we dig deeper into the history, we know that this was not always the case. So we know that, therefore, any approach to Islam and any Islamic intellectual tradition has been constructed in the minds of those who have interpreted it. Yeah. So it is very difficult then to maintain that any concrete form of Islam exhausts all the possibilities of interpreting the idea of Islam. In my books on the academic theory of progressive Islam, I have tried to situate what I consider to be progressive Islam, or the theory of progressive Islam, in relation to all these debates that have happened in the Islamic intellectual tradition, and I have tried to situate what I consider to be progressive Islam. In order for us to have some understanding of what I mean by the academic theory of progressive Islam, I can perhaps identify what I call the lowest common denominators of what it means to approach the Islamic tradition from a progressive perspective. Now, first of all, one of the major features of progressive Islam is this idea of what I call epistemological openness and methodological fluidity, which means it's an open, progressive Islam is always able to update itself. It's not a closed body of knowledge, right? While it is informed by the pre-modern Islamic interpretative tradition, it is also able to transcend this by constantly critiquing, fruitfully and constructively critiquing the same tradition and updating it from the perspective of contemporary epistemology, contemporary sources and forms of knowledge that are also considered to be valid when it comes to understanding the Islamic interpretative tradition as a whole. So there is no particular cutoff point where we say, well, okay, this is what Islam is and can never be. We understand that what people have understood Islam to be has always been a process and a product of construction and reconstruction. And there is no good reason to believe that this process should end at any point in time. Or epistemologically, there is this openness about progressive Islam. And methodologically, also it is not constrained by methodologies of, let's say, mainstream Sunni Islam. Because mainstream Sunni Islam, when it comes to its interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah, it's based upon a particular manhaj or usul al-fiqh. Yeah? And we know, for example, that in mainstream Sunni Islam, what gives rise to a particular interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah and the intellectual tradition is based upon a particular usul al-fiqh manhaj, or a set of interpretational assumptions that govern what interpretations of the Quran and the Sunnah and the Islamic intellectual tradition can actually be constructed and can be actually become real. So while progressive Islam takes these into account, its manhaj is much more contextualist and rationalist in nature. All right? So that's another delineating feature of progressive Islam. It approaches the Islamic scripture, the Quran, much more contextually. That is to say, it recognizes that ethical, legal elements and injunctions in the Quran in particular are only contextually colored. They express themselves in a particular cultural context, in a particular civilizational and intellectual context. When we look at the Quranic terms in the Quran, like ethical terms like ihsan or adl or ma'aruf, all of these ethical terms in the Quran actually assume that the audience of the Quran already knows what these ethical terms mean, which means that they are rationalist in nature. The Quran doesn't define any ethical terms because it assumes that the people already know what they are. So this rationalist and contextualist approach to the Quran, according to progressive Islamic thought, is warranted and actually required by the Quran and the Sunnah itself. Now, the concept of Sunnah in progressive Islam is also approached differently from, let's say, mainstream Sunni or Shia Islam, because it is not textually constrained. It is not just based on hadith, because, and I have published a lot on this topic of Sunnah. I have edited a volume on the concept of Sunnah in formative period of Islam. The concept of Sunnah was much broader and more dynamic, and it evolved as a concept. Before it was constrained, and before it was given its particular conceptualization by what we consider to be today mainstream Sunni Islam. So these are the two main features of progressive Islam when it comes to its interpretation of the Islamic intellectual tradition and its approach to modernity. Yeah? So openness, epistemological openness, methodological fluidity, using methods and sciences that have given us new insights, new knowledge, new approaches to interpretation of texts like contemporary hermeneutics, conceptual history, sciences pertaining to, interpretation of literary theory, and all of these sciences have importance and can legitimately be used to understand the nature of the Islamic intellectual tradition, to understand some of its blind spots, and to also help us elucidate the Quran and the Sunnah in a different, perhaps sometimes in a different manner. For example, we know that one of the major features of the pre-modern Islamic intellectual tradition when it comes to the interpretation of the Quran is that it was primarily done by men. Yeah? And therefore, when we look at, for example, tafsir al-Quran, yeah, we often see that there are certain biases, or it is often approached from an androcentric or through a male lens, yeah, through privileging male experiences. And this has colored and influenced, for example, also the nature of Islamic law, where we see, for example, where men have been given a superior status in relation to women. Yeah. So, and progressive Muslim thought would often say that this androcentric bias that we find in Islamic law, Islamic ethics, and in the Quranic interpretation is the product of, often a product of the interpreters, or the nature of the interpreters themselves, in this case men, who have often projected and infused their own ideas about what it means to be a man or a woman, or cultural biases or scientific thinking of that time. And we remember that most influential Quranic tafsirs were written between 8 to 1,000 years ago, 800 years to 1,000 years ago. So they were written in a radically different cultural context. So that's one example where we use so progressive Muslim thought uses contemporary ideas of pertaining to literary theory or gender, uses gender as an analytical tool to deconstruct and evaluate and judge the interpretations of the Quran, and try to distill or try to differentiate between what a reasonable interpretation of the certain Quranic concepts might be, compared to what interpretations we have inherited from in our Islamic interpretive tradition. So that's, for example, one element. Yeah. Now, I have often also been asked, why use the term progressive? Yeah. Now, there are a number of reasons why. I was not the first person who has used this term progressive. When we look at modern Islamic history, we see that the concept of progressive Islam has been mentioned, for example, in Southeast Asia, or even in the subcontinent in India. Yeah. At the time, it was India prior to the partition. So I'm not the first person to use that concept. Now, why progressive? When we look at the word progressive, it can mean several things, depending upon what we are interested in. Now, the word progressive one of its meanings can be about this idea that things can improve in the future compared to what they are now, in ethical terms. So progressive Muslim thought, when it looks at the Quran as a whole and the Sunnah as a whole, it sees that it wanted to improve the situation of the time of the people who received the revelation directly. It had an ethical horizon. It was envisioning a higher ethical horizon compared to what was prevalent at that time. So progressive Muslim thought wants to stay true to this idea that ethics can evolve and things, although it is contextual, yes, it is contextual, but it can also evolve. So what was most ethical at a certain point in time in Islamic history or the history of humanity does not necessarily mean that it is always going to be so. Yeah. So Quran and Sunnah confronted a particular reality that was based on certain ethical practices, and it tried to make it and change it for the better. Right? From there, progressive Muslim thought extrapolates a teleological kind of, it has a teleology. In other words, it believes that there is this trajectory that the Quran and the Sunnah try to, that there is a trajectory towards ever better, ever evolving ethics whose ultimate purpose is to ensure that each and every human being can flourish to the highest extent possible. Yeah. And therefore there is no cutoff point that we can say that, well, at this point in time, ethics was perfected and it can never change, or, there is no possibility of there ever being a better world than what it was in the past. Yeah. And actually, when we think of the concept of Sharia itself, not Sharia in the Islamic law sense of the term, with the ontology of the concept of Sharia, that tells us about the nature of God, the God as the ultimate source of beauty, God as the ultimate source of justice, the ultimate source of compassion and mercy. If you do not have a theory of ethics that allows you to say that ethics can evolve and become better, potentially, not inevitably, but potentially, ethics could evolve and we could have a better world in the future than what it is now or what it was in the past. That is the ultimate point of Sharia. Actually, it is to bring humanity closer to its source, God, who is the ultimate embodiment of these ethical values, such as beauty, such as compassion, such as justice. Yeah. So, and unfortunately, from the perspective of progressive Islam, mainstream forms of Islam, both Sunni and Shia, do not have this capacity because they have what I call a theory of time and history that strongly postulates that is based upon this idea that perfection resides in the past. Yeah. And that there is no possibility of ethical improvement in the future, because the perfection was realized at a particular point in time in history. That is during the event of the Quran and the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So one understanding of the concept of progressive, it means that it allows for the possibility of moral and ethical progress. There are other religious traditions that have similar approaches to their own Islamic intellectual tradition. And they themselves have used, for example, there is progressive Christianity, progressive Judaism, progressive Hinduism, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to basically say, that to the non-Muslim audiences, it is also possible to interpret Islam and the Islamic tradition in the similar manner, in a similar progressive manner as these other religious traditions are also interpreted, because there are affinities between these interpretations. One element of progressive Islam also has to do with politics and political change. So here progressive refers to this idea that on a political spectrum, progressive Islam is more socialist, it is left-oriented in a kind of a political sense of the term. Yeah. Progressive Islam uses additional labels to kind of label itself. So apart from progressive Islam, I have used in my theory of progressive Islam terminology such as critical traditionalism, cosmopolitanism, and humanistic understanding of Islam. These are all more or less interchangeable, depending upon what aspect of the theory of progressive Islam do you want to emphasize.
Sir, it is the fact that time and modernization make easiness and bring transition in anything, but the foundation of anything remains stagnant. So the fundamentals of Islam are the same in any time. So therefore, how would you distinguish traditional and modern Muslims and Muslim thoughts?
First of all, when it comes to the issue of Islam and modernity, progressive Muslim thought says that, look, modernity cannot be a product of just one religion or one civilization. There is interplay, there is cross-pollination, there is interaction between civilizations and religious traditions themselves. Yeah? And Quran is a perfect example of actually, Quran, like other religious scripts in the Near East during the late antiquity, it refers to other religious traditions, it refers to other civilizations, and it cannot be assessed or evaluated in a historical vacuum. All right. So the scripture itself cannot be approached in a cultural and historical vacuum. And ideas that give rise to civilizations and cultures, including modernity, they are always a byproduct of multiple interactions between different cultures, different civilizations. So it's not possible to say, for example, that justice is just Islamic, or love is just Christian, or consciousness is just a Hindu. Progressive Islam does not recognize these binaries and dichotomies. Yeah? And history, I believe, is on the side of progressive Islam in that sense, that it is impossible to identify and pinpoint and to say that, oh, well, this idea can only be found here and nowhere else. And it's a product of just one mind or one culture. No, it doesn't work like that. It is accumulative, it is dynamic, and it is a product of interactions and what I call cross-pollinations. Therefore, when we talk about modernity, we cannot say it is Western or it is Islamic, or we can say that there is a modernity that can unfold itself in an Islamic cultural or civilizational context, or in a other context. Yeah. So the ideas, that's why, for example, I said progressive Islam is characterized, one of the things that is characterized is by this epistemological openness and methodological fluidity, because it doesn't say that, certain forms of knowledge are just Western or certain forms of knowledge are just Islamic. There is no such thing as, the way knowledge is justified or rationalized, or the cosmology within which it is embedded, that can be Islamic, or can be theistic or atheistic. But knowledge itself, its sources and its nature, is not specific or peculiar to a particular religion or civilization. So that's why progressive Islam does not have any issues with critically evaluating any idea or concept. It doesn't matter if it emerged in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, or whatever it is. We need to always make a distinction between religion and religious knowledge. As you know, I'm not sure if your audience is familiar with Professor Abdul Karim Surush's distinction between religion, which is a concept that is an abstract concept, an idea, and religious knowledge, which is a human construction of that idea at any point in time. So there is always a kind of metaphysically or ontologically unbridgeable gap between human understanding of religion and religion itself. What mainstream Sunni Islam might consider to be a non-negotiable, immutable aspect of Islam is constructed on a particular basis or it's a construction of a particular approach to the Islamic interpretative tradition. And if you do not consider this to be valid, or you have alternative approaches, then your set of fundamentals can be, and non-negotiables can be different. That's why every interpretation of Islam is contingent upon a particular community of interpretation that has given rise to that understanding of Islam in the first place. Because there is here inherently we have agency, human agency that exercises itself through the mind in trying to understand what Islam is. That is not to say that I'm not denigrating other interpretations. I'm just saying that what one considers to be a non-negotiable element of a particular approach to the Islamic tradition is only valid insofar as you accept the presuppositions upon which that interpretation approach is premised. Any particular manifestation of Islam in an intellectual sense is a product of human agency and human interpreters, or even better, a community of interpreters, that are bound by a particular methodology or manhaj of interpretation. All right, so I'm not sure if that makes sense. Therefore, basically what I'm trying to emphasize here is, we see this, we have a plethora of different understandings of Islam, That if you look at the history of Islam, we see that there are many sects, many groups, and all of them basically have said that, oh, this is non-negotiable for us, and therefore this is what distinguishes us from another. So in the ultimate analysis, it is the interpretational approach that has certain presuppositions, certain interpretational assumptions that will give rise to a particular form of Islam. And within that form of Islam, there would be certain non-negotiables, immutable elements that are only valid insofar as you accept that entire approach to Islam.
Sir, as you know, Islam is the only religion which has given rights and equality to gender, especially the women. Then why Islam is being taken in a negative sense? As you know, Islam is the complete code of life as guidance in the Holy Quran and Hadith. What is your analysis?
All right, so again, what we call traditional mainstream Sunni Islam, and I had defined it earlier on, it's a product of human reasoning, and it's a particular, it's an intellectual tradition. Now, when we look at gender issues in Islamic law and ethics, we cannot, and tafsir, we cannot but And remember, most of these were written nearly 1,000 years ago. Yeah? And mainstream Sunni Islam upholds, it kind of gives them a privileged status to these interpretations over any subsequent ones. Yeah? Because of the concept of ijma and because of a particular usul al-fiqh that gives mainstream Sunni Islam the shape that it has. But we see, for example, that the ideas that people had about masculinity or femininity, the nature of male, what it means to be a male and a female, especially the nature of male-female sexuality, these ideas tend to portray a picture of men as being superior, as being rational, as they are only able to exercise political and religious power. Yeah? And they paint a picture of women as very emotional, that they should stay out of the public sphere of politics and religion. They are not allowed to exercise any forms of religious authority or political authority. There's this idea that female sexuality is very morally eroding and dangerous. And because mainstream Sunni Islam is based upon these ideas of masculinity and femininity, it has come up with particular interpretations of concepts that we find in the Quran or the Hadith. For example, qiwama and wilaya and ta'a, and all of these concepts that pertain to gender relations have been interpreted through these ideas of what it means to be a male and a female. And these ideas of what it means to be a male and a female have been derived from, not necessarily from a contextualist and holistic understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. They have been often based on particular interpretations of few isolated hadith, or they have been simply assumed to be true because at that time when they were writing, the cultures in which they lived were very patriarchal. You know, everybody thought that only men could be rational and reasonable, and not only just men, but only few selected elite men. That the society of that time was very hierarchical, where you had, you know, a small group of men, literate men, who were considered as rational and reasonable. Then you had other men, and then you had women, and then you had slaves and children. So that's why we find in Islamic ethics and Islamic law ideas that women are lesser, that they do not have the same kind of intellectual and moral agency as do men have. That's why they don't enjoy same rights and they don't have the same entitlements. But that is in classical Islamic law. That doesn't mean that is the only way we can interpret the Quran and the Sunnah. Yeah? So progressive Islam then deconstructs these ideas and says, well, where do they come from? And are they really reflective of what the Quran and the Sunnah say? And do they make sense rationally? Yeah? And do they make sense to what we experience today as human beings? We can see there are many women who are highly educated, who are very intellectual. So these ideas don't really make sense. And you know, some mufassirun and some fuqaha even said that God prefers men over women ontologically, that women are inferior to men ontologically, that is what God wanted, and they use the hadith of the rib. Okay, so there are all these problematic ideas that have played a role in which Muslim cultures have understood what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man. And it has shaped, unfortunately, it has shaped Islamic ethics and Islamic law very strongly.
Sir, thank you so much for your valuable in-depth analysis on the contemporary and traditional progressive Islam. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for having me.